It's time now for the news review of the bulletin. Russia says it will deploy around 20 new military formations and units near its western borders by the end of the year, in response to NATO's actions. The Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said that the actions of the West are destroying the world's security system and forcing Moscow to take, quote, adequate countermeasures. He noted that NATO member states led by the U.S. are ramping up the intensity of their presence, while the number of their military drills is also increasing. Russia's military buildup followed an uptick in fighting in eastern Ukraine, where government forces and pro-Russia fighters have been fighting since 2014. Moscow said that deployments were in response to NATO's activities near its western borders. Tell us more about this. Marina Kortunova is our correspondent joining us from Moscow. Then we have Marcus Papadopoulos, historian, analyst, and author, joining us from London for a breakdown and an analysis. Well, Marina, tell us more about this move that Russia is making in response.
Good evening. Sergei Shoigu, Russian defense minister, announced the creation of new military units in Russia to confront NATO. In the Western military district, 20 new formations and military units will be created. And according to him, the situation in the Western strategic direction is characterized by growing military threats. In particular, according to him, the intensity of flights of the U.S. Air Force strategic aviation there has grown 7 times since 2014. NATO ships with guided missile weapons regularly enter the Baltic Sea in the Kaliningrad region. In this year, for example, Western countries are preparing the largest ones in 30 years exercises with the participation of 40,000 military personnel, plus to the recent drill by our borders. So Shoigu explained that these organizational measures will be synchronized with the supply of modern weapons and military equipment. This year it is planned to supply about 2,000 weapons to the troops of the district. And in addition, according to Shoigu, active combat training is underway in the existing units and formation of the Western military districts and the Baltic Fleet. So the intensity of working out combat training tasks by the ships of the Baltic Fleet has increased by 30%, and more than 200 exercises were performed using various types of weapons. The air raid of the district's aviation increased by 4%. So the fact that the military Ministry of Defense is discussing plans to create new military units and formations in the Western direction was reported back in 2019, almost 2 years ago. So according to a person close to the leadership of the Ministry of Defense, the increase of the combat capabilities of the Western military district has been consistently carried out over the past 6 years, and for 2 different reasons. First, because of the aggressive buildup of NATO's military infrastructure in the territories bordering with Russia, and then as a result of the outbreak of the conflict in southeastern Ukraine. Most likely, the plans to further build up the forces of the Russian army on its western borders with the implementation of the U.S. plans to deploy missiles that previously fell under the Treaty of Intermediate Range and Shorter Range Missiles, from which Washington withdrew. So in the same year, one of the largest Belarusian exercises, Union Shield, if I'm not mistaken, Union Shield 2019 was held. And last year in September 2020, against the background of an unstable political situation in Belarus, an annual exercise was held, Slavic Brotherhood 2020.
Thank you very much for that. Marcus Papadopoulos, I can't think of where the U.S. and its allies are not pressuring Russia. You're looking at the EU with the sanctions, you're looking at the U.S. with the sanctions, the military provocations in some senses, and just anything that you could think of practically that can get a reaction out of them. They apply pressure on Russia. Where is all this pressure going to head to? What is the end game of the U.S. and its allies by exerting all this pressure on Russia?
NATO is an expansionist bloc that has demonstrated its credentials for duplicity and criminality for many years now. So, for instance, NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe and into the Baltic states to the Russian border broke a verbal assurance which George Bush Sr. gave to Mikhail Gorbachev in 1990. Secondly, the permanent presence of NATO forces along the western border of the Russian Federation is a major violation of the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997. And thirdly, when NATO bombed Serbia in 1999, or as it was then, the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, NATO actually violated its own founding treaty, specifically Article 1 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which stipulates clearly and categorically that NATO will never use force to resolve disputes. Now, when we have a look at the situation concerning relations between NATO and Russia, it is very clear, it is painstakingly clear that NATO is pursuing a very aggressive approach towards Russia. The amount of NATO maneuvers, including many numbers of soldiery and weaponry, is taking place on a frequent basis. The amount of soldiery and weaponry along the Russian border is being increased by NATO. The amount of flights by American strategic bombers close to Russian airspace is increasing with great speed. The presence of NATO warships, not just in the Baltic Sea, but in particular in the Black Sea, is gaining more and more speed. The Americans are rebuilding certain Ukrainian ports, specifically Odessa and Okhotsk, so that they can accommodate American battleships. Then we have NATO's very clear plans for Ukraine to join the ranks of the military bloc, namely NATO. So when you put all that together, you can see that Russia has every right to respond. Russia has every right to increase the amount of its own soldiery and weaponry along its western border. Russia has every right to increase its defense budget. Russian national security is seriously threatened by NATO, and America, through NATO, is attempting to weaken Russia in Europe and thereby weaken Russia in the world, in the hope that a weakened Russia in the world will derail Russia's current status as a superpower once again. If Russia loses its status as a superpower, so for instance by Ukraine joining NATO, then America will be the sole superpower in the world once again, and the world will be a most dangerous place. The world will go back to how it was in the 1990s, when America was able to do as it pleased because there was no resistance, there was no counterbalance in the form of Russia. So Russia is responding to a very dangerous threat from America in the form of NATO.
Okay, thank you for that. Marcus Papadopoulos, historian, analyst, and author. I'd like to also thank Marina Kortunova, correspondent there from Moscow. That brings us to an end of this news review.